Hello friends, today's lecture is on the American author, the fiction writer and poet Jack London by name, and he was in the later part of the 19th century and lived till the First World War. A short life of course, but he had his presence very prominently in the world of literature in America. Jack London was a name that was to reckon with. People listened to him. They also sometimes, saw the movies based on his novels, and he had social concerns in his heart, and these social concerns would make him very popular. This is the general information that I have, and I look forward to listening to Dr. Bajaj, Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University. So she'll be discussing today under this series, which is devoted to short story. She'll be discussing Jack London's short stories in general, and will focus upon one or two, so that the point regarding his stance, his attitude, his opinion, his appeal is recognized properly by us as a short story writer. So without much ado, I request Dr. Bajaj to please start our lecture, and we'll be of course discussing things variously as the lecture proceeds. So Dr. Richa Bajaj, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. I will discuss Jack London today as a short story writer. Of course, he's a novelist as well. Most writers that we've picked up in this series are basically fiction writers who have written novels and also short stories. In some cases, we found that the short stories were written in the beginning of the career and one steadily moved to writing novels. But in most cases, as has been the case in the 19th century, writers had been writing short stories along with the novels. So, in fact, short stories were published in magazines, just as novels were published in serialized forms. So in the serialized form, you had a novel which was published and finally brought together as a book. So, the trend of fiction in the 19th century, of course, has a lot to do. We've had a discussion on the novel form and the fiction form in general, but also we've discussed the short story form that emerged in a big way in the 19th century. Also because the short story gave us a glimpse into the lives of people at the time without one having to spend a lot of time in the, as was the case in the novel. Now, when we come to Jack London and in America, then you see this particular period in America, the 19th century, is a tumultuous period, as we all know, the American Civil War. It was, fraught with violence, and post the Civil War, then even when the rights of the black people they had been won, the rights of the common people, the workers, had not been. Right, and in fact, this is the period when you see a lot of workers' union coming into being because of industrializations and large-scale industries, also industrialists turning into corporates and industries turning into corporations. You found that it gave rise to a lot of unemployment at the same time. So while there was a large working class in London, so in America, you find that there is at the same time an escalating rate of unemployment, and you also find that mostly post Civil War, the policies, the legal framework, all of it was made keeping in mind the growing capitalist class. These were framed according to the needs of the industrialists, and had very little in these policies and rights had very little for workers, and there were in fact no labor rights as such. So this kind of an environment created a crisis, almost a sort of an economic crisis that culminated in the 1890s, the decade when we also speak of the panic of 1893. Now, against this background, we need to speak of Jack London as an author, journalist, social activist, a human rights supporter, animal rights supporter, so a supporter of socialism and unionization. How he fought with how he fought against unemployment, fought against exploitation that occurred not just of human beings but also of animals, because of this greed that was being seen all around, this kind of desire to make easy buck or make a fortune in America. This also is the backdrop against which finally the American dream gets built, you know, of making quick money and becoming rich and having estates and you know, ranches on which ranches that you could own. So I think this is the America that Jack London really inhabits. His time period is from 1876 to 1916. So you can see that you know, a lot of his works come out in the first decade of the 20th century. In fact, some of them have been written around the 1890s, just the period when America was going through a lot of financial crisis. So this period, and he dies in 1916, which means this is the period of the war. So he was in fact a war correspondent also. He was a journalist who was also giving details about the Russian-Japan sort of an encounter conflict that took place in the first decade of the 20th century, but also that he was witness to the war period as well. And this is the background. So he's best known obviously for his novels, Jack London, that is, The Call of the Wild and White Fangs. These two novels he's known for. In fact, they've been made into films and are available online. I in fact would invite you to go watch them and read the books. Again, 1903 is the period around which he's writing all this. Both of these novels are actually set in Alaska. Somehow London was very enamored of this north, you know, the cold northern America, that was the hazardous place that tested human beings' will for survival. So he bases a lot of his works around this region, the Alaskan region, and he brings into discussion these very elemental questions of survival, you know, vis-a-vis the novels that he writes. And you find that both the novels, The Call of the Wild and White Fangs, both of them also have centrally the dogs as characters, the central characters, or as protagonists. It is through their consciousness that you actually see the world, the human world, the natural world, and so there is a sort of distance that is provided when you look at human beings from outside as an animal would. So you know, the placing the dogs at the center of his narratives gives him that kind of an advantage, this kind of a viewpoint. But at the same time, it also talks about his sensitivity to the animals, and how he spoke about animal rights as well. Now the short stories that London wrote were also, you know, they also extended this theme of the Alaskan North. More importantly, the northern landscape and the Canadian gold rush. You know, these are the central themes of London's work. In fact, they feed his creativity. You know, they are a constant source of creativity, this theme of the Canadian gold rush. To give you an overview of what this Canadian gold rush is, let me take you to this Klondike gold rush that actually refers to the discovery of gold in the 1890s in the Yukon region of Canada, that drove many poor and destitute people in America to try their luck at making a fortune. You find that this Klondike gold rush is actually a metaphor that you know, runs through his novels, because he's talking about the gold being discovered. Now, gold was obviously discovered in America as well. In fact, we know that how there was an entire story of the gold story, that people from Europe migrated to America because they felt that there was a lot of gold to be found over there. So throughout the 19th century, the discoveries were there in America, but this Klondike gold rush is in Canada. So all of it, you know, this is in the 1890s, a sort of a last ditch attempt by Americans who want to make easy money, who want to make a fortune, and they think that if they only travel to the northern region, the northwest region, the Yukon region, which is like near the Arctic, if they only travel to that region, they would be able to mine gold and bring gold back. So, but the region is so difficult and to traverse. It's not one of those that it actually tests the lives of people. Most of them perish on the way. So in a way, this kind of greed, human greed, or you could say this madness of frenzy to take gold, what he calls the gold rush, or what is generally referred to as the Klondike gold rush, is something that London picks up in a lot of his works for depiction. You find you find prospectors coming from far and wide places to see gold in the Alaskan region, even when it meant incurring great suffering in the wild north. Many of these people perished on the way because of hunger, this extremity that they faced, because of avalanches that occurred in that region, and also attacks by wild animals. They had wolves, and there are reference to bears. How human beings interact with the natural surrounding, that is also something that he picks up for analysis in his stories as also the novels. Now, the gold seekers, if you look at this quote by The Nature of Gold, this is the book by Catherine Morse, where we are told that this kind of a large scale sort of adventure trips took place. The gold seekers on the Chilkoot Pass and on the other trails and rivers that led to the Yukon and Alaska risked their lives in pursuit of gold. Why? The answer perhaps seems simple: gold would make them rich. So you see, this frenzy to become rich at the time, during the last decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 19th century, would work to feed into the entire narrative of becoming rich in America. The great American boom, or the great sort of American dream of becoming rich. So these gold seekers would take this very hazardous path of the Chilkoot Pass and take trails, go via rivers to the Yukon region, to Alaska. They would risk their lives just to take gold back home, and gold, they know, would make them rich. So gold in itself becomes more symbolic in all these stories and novels of Jack London, as you find to be the case. I will discuss two stories today where we'll discuss how this becomes a kind of a major leitmotif in London's work. Now, the Yukon gold fields become this sort of a metaphor, I said, in the works of London, who uses it to comment on the state of affairs at the time in America. Now, what is the state of affairs in America at the time? You see, Jack London himself quit his education at the University of California because he could not afford it any longer. I mean, he really wanted to get admission in the first place, and he crammed up all the, a lot of these courses, 4 years course he tried to finish in one, and he joined the University of California because he wanted to be educated, but he lacked the money to study there, and he couldn't afford it, and desperate because of and obviously forced by poverty, he left the university and joined, in fact, this Klondike gold rush movement in 1897. So what he depicts in his novels and what he depicts in the stories, you actually find that he has been a victim of himself. He tried to undertake one such journey in 1897. Of course, he came back came back as poor as he had went, and as disillusioned with this kind of a enterprise. But then it fed into his memory and his imagination, and he went on to write some brilliant short stories, and of course the reference to it in the novels is very much there. But what we need to remember is that it is something that enamored this generation of the 1890s. And why? Because there was already a financial crisis that was looming large in 1893 that stared them in the face. I'm of course referring to the panic of 1893 that lasted 4 years in America. It was the first time that America actually faced this kind of of economic depression of this magnitude in American history, where hundreds of national banks shut down and businesses failed. You find that the Wall Street brokerage houses collapsed. Then there was large-scale unemployment, so national unemployment escalated at an unprecedented scale. Labor unrest gained momentum at the time. So it is against this background that we are looking at this kind of the gold prospectors, who are going, this gold seekers who are going north now to find gold, that they have lost jobs, banks have collapsed in 1893, the brokerage houses are not working, the Wall Street is almost sort of shut. So this is, and the labor unions are being formed, reforms are being asked by by all these movements. This period was also marked by several workers' strikes and processions and marches that took place. In fact, Jack London had taken odd jobs, throughout his growing up years. At the age of till from 14 onwards, he tried to take one job of another or another because of poverty that he faced. He took up these odd jobs, sometimes as a sailor. At others, he worked in a mill. Or at a power plant, and he was sick of this work trap, and all this led towards his inclination towards socialism then, and he was steadily moving towards socialism. And all these attempts that he made, going to the north with this sort of with other sailors and other men who tried to find gold, or trying to work in factories, he felt that this was not enough and that he was still as poor as he was. So he also joined a lot of these labor unrest movements, some of them including like Coxey's Army, which was a protest march that was organized in 1894 by unemployed workers who marched in Washington for labor rights and for reform in the system, because all the policies, as I told you earlier, were framed according to the industrialists and the capitalists and favored them. Now the workers wanted more rights for themselves, higher wages for themselves, some more leaves for themselves, while all this was not available. In fact, this is therefore the period of great tumult, as I said, in America. London was also, Jack London was also jailed for vagrancy in the same year, where he spent a month in the Erie County Pen in New York. And his awful experiences of living in a pen, and which is a prison house, spoke about, and how he speaks of this human degradation, is all this is penned in this story that he wrote, The Pen. But before I move on to talk about this story, The Pen, I would like your take on this kind of life in America at the time, where London has to deal with these issues. And what do you think of this gold rush at the time, the Klondike gold rush, the Canadian gold rush, where people are rushing to Canada, to Alaska to find gold?
It's really very interesting to know that there is a writer who is in the middle of all these tumults, as you call them, the struggles of people, etc. So what makes him write then? Are they writings of protest? Are they writings of recognition? Are they writings devoted to change? How do you, for instance, if I looked at such a person, I would say that he would be capturing the villains and the gods or whatever in such a way that the two contrast with each other, and he is able to criticize people very vitally. So what exactly has happened in the case of Jack London with respect to his short stories or his attitude towards life?
So, this is the period that I've spoken till now, the 1894, 1897, when he takes his trip for the gold rush and returns empty-handed, etc. This is the period when he's still trying his luck. This is not exactly the period when he's writing. He writes, but not the kind of social criticism that he offers later in his life when he goes into becoming a full-time writer. So he's tried his hand at being a worker. He's also stolen, things, oysters. He comes in touch with pirates. So it's a very adventurous sort of a life that he has lived, forced by poverty, in fact, because he's unable to make his ends meet. So this is the moment when he's not really writing the kind of social criticism that he goes on to write later, after all these experiences are behind him.
So this period is his formative period.
Right.
This is the period that gives him the kind of sensibility that will make him write further.
Yes, and the outlook that he has on these years obviously is one of maturity when he deals with it as a part of his past. So when these stories and these novels are published in 1903 or so, this is the period when Jack London decides to wholeheartedly devote himself to writing and try and make money through writing. And in fact, he is one of the few writers who is able to make money through writing, through his works, and he's able to in fact build a name for himself during this period after all these adventures that he's had. But this has gone into making him a sort of a socialist writer that he claims himself to be. In fact, he says at one point that, well, if this is how capitalism works, then let me enter the system and work through it and work within it. So there is a sense of, there is a very deep understanding of things. For instance, hunger. And you know, at some place he says that, well, hunger, you don't understand it, because you don't even understand what it means to be hungry. So I think all these experiences he tries to bring them together in his works and project them later as he experienced at one point in his time.
So Civil War has left a kind of impact on his sensibility regarding social consciousness and all those things?
Not so much the Civil War. You see, the Civil War changed the entire system in America in the sense that money moved from the hands of the rich peasants, farmers in the south to the north, right? So when the manufacturing sector gained boost, and in fact, you know, the farmlands were, they receded to the margin, because now they could know, they didn't have the slaves with whom they could work. So the Civil War created a shift in the economy of America from an agriculture oriented country to a manufacturing country. And the moment the manufacturing sector came in, and the boost was received by this sector, it brought in with itself an entire class of workers who were looking for work. So the worker and the industrialist dynamic comes into being in the phase post 1860s and 70s.
Would it be right to say then that the social energy that was generated by the Civil War, that was finally misappropriated by the industrialists, and
Yes.
it didn't go to the masses?
Right, exactly. I would say that, you know, the equality for black rights became, I mean, they were, slavery was abolished, so of course the blacks were trying to find a dignified way of living. Equality was still a distant dream for them, because there were ghettos, and socially they were ostracized. But I think that this created a kind of you know, a kind of a division in society between the rich and the poor that was already there. Now the new rich were the industrialists and the new poor were the workers. It wasn't a racial divide any longer.
So friends, so far Dr. Bajaj has talked about the background against which this writer became committed, and he started, you know, becoming the voice of the oppressed in his own peculiar way, in his own vital way. And I think in the following discussion we'll be seeing these ideas again emerging in a crystallized form, because there will be references to his short stories. Thank you.